it's my duty to keep the floor flowing with discussions, although no one asked yet. So, yeah, last night I slept at 4 a.m. editing our audio guide, and it's been a tough job to work with this sound because not only editing takes this tension between wanted to keep genuine, to stay true to the original voice, while also on the other hand thinking of the speakers or the listeners, if they feel comfortable in listening to these voices, or if it makes sense or not, if it comprehensible or not. And then at one point between 3 a.m., I start to realize I need music in the audio guide. So I look for a sound of Akan drums from Africa to somehow make the background music of this one part in our audio guide about is it too much to ask the museum to respond something, although they're always the one that's too late because they're always dealing with something that already passed. And then I look for this sound of Akan drums. But then I start to realize why I need an Akan drums or drums from Africa to be presented in Tropenmuseum. I mean, I start to ask this initial response that I need a drum from Africa or a drum from Indonesia to become the background music. Yet, at one point, this is something that I think the complexities of sound, that sound can create a certain affect or feelings beyond the rational, the cognitive, while at the same time it doesn't really offer a clear definitions of its objective, what it want to say. So it's sort of between transparent and opacity. So if any one of you wants to respond to this, how sound can offer a different forms of objectivity, or what kind of objectivity that sound can offer, or listening can offer. Yes. You have my arm.
Yeah, thanks. I actually, as a maker of edits all the time, I wanted to respond from a practice really, because I actually in my works I never add any sound, I never add any music, because I think exactly what you're trying to describe is going on. Like you're going to add something that comes from another register, that comes from another purpose that I actually, and to the effect of, because sound and especially music has an incredible effect on a listener or a viewer, in terms of effect and emotion. So I don't want to add that as a kind of an additional layer coming from somewhere else. But that's a personal attitude, obviously, from my work. But I think that, like, when I treat sound, and often I have people making music in the work, so it comes in naturally. But in this case, in La Javanese, there was no music in that sense. But I do think that music is always created by the rhythm of the voice. You know, it's like any conversation has a certain musicality. So I don't think that kind of, you know, you're looking for something to add, but in fact, probably it's already there. Yeah, this is my attitude towards what it would be. That would be like a sound, musical quality that you want to add to something that has an informative or even an affective, informative purpose already, or something like this. So that's just from a maker.
Great. So I guess there's lots to talk about here. So. I guess probably what I would say is I didn't want to deny the effective potential of sound. I absolutely agree that, you know, there's lots to think about, especially during the edit. But maybe I think maybe it's a caution that I see now that people are telling me, like, I want to do this sound thing. And I sort of thought, oh, that's so interesting that there's this idea of doing sound, also for scholars. I think certainly there's this potential for a critical intervention, but perhaps that there are no guarantees. I think that's what I found disquieting, is this idea that there's some kind of guarantee or refuge from the visual, and that we perhaps too easily say that we don't have codifications and we don't have, say, racializations of the voice. So I think it's I think that's maybe the lesson I've taken from this sound studies field, is to be a bit careful about how we take some of our common sense ideas about what sound is and might be, especially when we bring it into, say, scholarly analysis. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that I want to respond by also telling a story about birds. And we talked a little bit about this the last time I was in Jogja, because I was going to bird song competitions and learning about this practice of that's called mastering, wherein people take recordings of extinct bird species songs and then play them to existing but different species of birds, to the point that those birds take on the voice of the extinct species. So your question was sort of about the content of sound and editing and the heavy decisions of cutting what to keep in and what to keep out. And I think that some of the presentations have sort of pushed towards questions not of the content of sound, but of the materiality, the technologies, and what kind of affordances different technologies allow. And so why I think the birds are a pretty mind-blowing thing is because it's an instance where we can see very clearly that the distinction between technology and nature is one which is very fluid, and that nature, or like birds, have a function of memory. They allow the people who train them to sing the songs of the extinct to carry the sound of lost environments. Yeah.
Nuning wants to ask something. Oh.
I'm Nuning from KUNCI. I'm interested in what Adam just said, and also try to connect it to what you said earlier in your presentation about the rich vocabulary of people who live in a Mount Merapi area, that they do have a rich vocabulary of Javanese language to tell about the mountain and the surrounding. My question is, maybe I can sense it because I'm also a Javanese too, but maybe based on your field work, maybe can you elaborate more on this vocabulary, and how would this vocabulary maybe narrate the contemporary social setting that go beyond the mountain environment? Because talking about sound or voice in a context like Indonesia is significant because and that is precisely why we choose audio guide in the first place, because sound has always been the domain that being suppressed. So it's always like means for ordering things. Yeah. So
I can't really say much more because I don't speak Japanese. So for me, the question was, so how what are the traces of this vocabulary within the scientific archive? What are the operations that the scientific archive produce on reality to shape the way that people then experience this volcano? So for me, there's references in the archive to this rich Javanese vocabulary. There's arguments and there's fights about what kind of words should be used to describe particular events on the volcano. So the point that I was trying to make is that standardization has to necessarily reduce things in order to travel, so that scientists on other volcanoes can have a conversation and understand what each other is saying. Now, I don't think that we should then do away with standardization. That's not a solution either. The question is rather to be very intentional about operations of standardization and what gets lost and what gets added.
I have a question. Yeah, because for me it's interesting. Yeah, I agree with you, but it's not doing away with one or the other, but also like it's the shift in paradigm in terms of knowing, in terms of, because we work a lot with the idea of tuning in, like in terms of like attentiveness, which is through tunes, and then through our practice, and how do, like, because for instance through Wendelien's work, for instance, what if we changed the sequence? Like, it's not the audio which is the same, but it's the visual which is the same, but using different audios. Like, what kind of difference could we get through or through that experience? But also tying it to what Carolyn said about. So how do you, like, speaking of, how do you address this speaking different modes of sensing instead of one over the other within educational context?
I just wanted to, I mean, it's a little bit, how can I say, contingent, but because I was thinking about power and sound that Caroline mentioned also. And originally, I mean, there's a lot of things to say about power and sound, and power and the voice, obviously, and power and radio. And originally, we were also talking about another piece of mine that I've shown at KUNCI, which is called No False Echoes, which is about the Dutch radio that had a very particular colonial relationship to Indonesia. But in this piece, because we saw it, I also wanted to point out something else that happens, and that is indeed, maybe I just want to go a little bit deeper into what happens in sound and dialogue, because, for instance, power and the dialogue in this work, in fact, I showed the fragment where it happens, is where the voices of these people that I brought into the museum, they start to turn against me, if you noticed. I mean, in a friendly way, but because we're all friends. But it was true that a split happened between myself and them, and that was also between them and the museum. In fact, probably it started with them and the museum, and then I was identified as the museum because I was the director of the film, let's say, or at least the person who asked them there, and I'm of the same culture of the museum's origins. And so I think this was very important to put back into the film, so this is like, you know, again, acts of editing. But it was very much in two levels, where it's like it's the official conversation that they're having, and then it's like the unofficial conversation that they're having when they want to go outside, when they just say like, let's get out of here. So I just want to point that out as kind of the internally in a sound track, this is also two levels of experience for an audience, because it's like, you know, the official let official, I mean, calling that is by lack of other word, but like what you listen to that they say, but then what you listen to where you're actually not supposed to listen is also important. So that's where, you know, as an editor, you put it in because you don't want to exclude that, because it's as important to hear how they are feeling being there as it is to hear her story of, you know, being a black model in the world of fashion. So I just wanted to sort of point that.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so I mean, I think you were also going in the direction, Ferdi, of this question about the possibility of different sensory methods. So I think this is really an important point, because I think sometimes we want to map one-to-one, and I think the lesson for me of sensory studies and, let's say, sensory methods is that we, you know, it may be through, you know, different registers, for instance, that we want to investigate radio. So it could be, in my case, a lot of the work I've been doing, thinking about these radio archives, the systems of cataloging, the kind of technical dimensions, the materiality, the systems of classification, and these renamings that I spoke about before, is actually via the textual and the visual that I can do this work. So I mean, there are recordings, but you know, it's very much the staging of the archive in photographic documentation. It's also about archives that have been partially looted, either from occupied Europe to Germany or from Germany to the UK and Russia after World War II, and also what happens, I guess, in the East-West archival situation in Germany. So we actually have a situation where a lot of the materials I'm looking at are not in archives, and they're through stock photography agencies. They're on wiki images. They, in different moments, according to whether they have value or not, these items have been removed or sent elsewhere. So I think that's something that I try to keep in mind, is not just that recordings of cultural others have been devalued in the post-World War I situation, where colonial institutes were defunded and people didn't have funding to do that work. Therefore, they tried to sell parts of their collections, or radio stations in a situation of economic depression tried to have releases. It's also about these collections being broken or dispersed between when they were formed and when I try to ask questions about them now. So I think that's something I try to keep in mind, that it's not, you know, thinking about sound is not only about listening or developing listening techniques or modes of analysis, but it's about also questioning the forms of presentation and circulation that produce the items that I look and read and listen to in the first place. So I think this is something that then it gets very meta. So I even got to the point now where I thought, do I have to somehow do some kind of history of the archive before I can talk about some of the ideas bound up with these sound recordings? And I think this is a bit the tension with these kinds of projects, that they're often quite convoluted institutional histories that sometimes I think scholars want to partially bracket out as well, because you know, even in the case of looted archives in Europe, some of the sound recordings we encounter, if we go to Frankfurt and we go to the radio archive and say, can I listen to a digital file? They've been copied, selected, probably, you know, across borders up to 3 or 4 times before we encounter them. And that's something that the institutional archive that I visit now doesn't have a very strong record about. And the people who knew about those moments are retired or they've passed away. So I think this is also, you know, the examples I showed of sonic heritage projects are also part of that stripping away of, I guess, provenance and copying and selection, and that's something I'm trying to push a little bit against. That, you know, it's great to digitize 500,000 recordings in Europe, but if we, you know, just perform the same stripping away of provenance, we're also we're treating it again as source and not thinking about these recordings as objects. And I think there's really a lot of potential to ask some more questions about these collections. Thanks.
Yeah, or does somebody have a question? I don't want to.
Testing. I actually haven't had the opportunity to listen to the audio guide, but maybe perhaps I will after this session. But I just wanted to ask whether performance, is being considered in developing the audio guide. Because you're supposed to listen to it while you walk around the museum, right? So, in a way, the audio is actually triggering the choreography of the body. And I was wondering, is anybody in the panel, considering the relationship between sound and performance through the body?
Maybe Sarah, and then...
Yeah, and then we respond to the question.
Yeah, in a way, hi. What I wanted to add is also maybe related to this last question. It's not really a question, it's more just like I wanted to bring up something about the voice and sound in a more purely kind of linguistic perspective, because I think what is very interesting of the voice is that it's kind of the in-between place where the archive of language, so the paradigm then also is spoken, transformed, and where also slowly becomes another type of paradigm. So like, for instance, in traditional or like traditional semiotics, like la parole, so like the spoken language is the place where the archive of language becomes a body, but it's also the place where it is manipulated and slowly is transformed. But this transformation feeds back the archive again to be again appropriated and transformed, and it happens through the body. And yeah, I just wanted to add that.
The first question was about if performance are considered when doing the audio guide, and the question also addressed if any of the speakers wants to respond to this connection between sound and performance. So maybe we can, to give time to the speakers, maybe someone from KUNCI can explain about if performance are considered during the production of the audio guide. Nuning?
We actually thinking about choreography or performance actually comes second after voice. So voice is actually one thing that we first thought of, and because we want to play with the idea of appropriation, so we want to use one of the body, one of the mannequin here, Sulastri, as the representation of our voice, and also mix it with her voice, because we are playing with a mannequin of a character of a novel that we also read for our reading group before we came here. And also we want to play with the idea of the broken voice or the losing voice, because it happened that the audio fragment here to represent the Sulastri is broken. So we are kind of so we're going to feel that, and the performance is so we intentionally make the point where Sulastri standing as the first point, and then we follow the second point is here is called the beginning. Actually, where you are shown the map that is made 30 years after the first fleet of the Hollanders came to Batavia and then remodeled the Batavia. And we kind of play with the rumpius. So we actually introduce the listeners to Sulastri's friends, all the mannequins here. So Sulastri and then rumpius, and then we bring it back again to the point where the book of rumpius is chained to the table, where you can also see the images of the tropics shown by all the paintings, the Moi indie paintings, and then ask the listeners to roam the rooms where the mannequins are, the stages. Yeah, and then we ended to the Papua section as a sort of like reflection that this is actually also the territory that we don't really know. We want to play the idea with distance. Also something that we want to know more about Papua that of course it's not being addressed here, and also something that we don't often get. And it is very important to emphasize that now, especially because in Indonesia, with all the rising of, like the next generation of the Free Papua movement and etc.
Maybe to add that the choreography is more like in terms of performance. It's not so much related to like bodily like we do think about the body, but in relation to the space always. So if you see the map that we distribute, it's a kind of movement, like body in movement. And yeah, I don't know, maybe it's also related to sound, actually.
So, also a brief presentation from KUNCI about the audio guide. But then let's go back to the remain questions from the audience. Anyone wants to respond? Maybe we still have 5 minutes. Huh? We're out of time. We're out of time? Can we have more 5 minutes? Yeah, it feels very fast. We have the last 5 minutes to respond to the questions. So the second question. Oh. Yes.
Sorry. No, Dina?
Yeah.
I actually feel that I still should answer the question on the performance, because it was also addressed to the panel members, no? Have we thought about sound and performance? And obviously, yes, but I feel like it's also, I'm struggling here a little bit with what kind of register I'm thinking of, because the way that I've looked at archives, or the way that I think about my work functioning, is very much as things you talked about, like alternative ways of knowing, and I feel that the work actually could possibly open up alternative ways of knowing. So I'm working from that perspective. Yeah. I'm not working towards understanding these forms of knowing. So I just feel like how to then maneuver these questions that are coming in different kind of registers, then in terms, of course, of performance, I can say something about how, indeed, if one works with a camera and sound, then it's very important, and realness is something that I feel connected to. Like the way that I make the work is through a kind of attachment to something that I call realness. And how do I choreograph that? I don't direct it. So in a way, I find it very interesting. How can one indeed prompt certain choreographies out of making situation around issue, around certain conversations, around thoughts, concepts, location, that are then not pre-drawn out. So they come out of, let's say the performance comes out of that actual situation. Which, I mean, again, it's just I can only say how I do it or why I do that, but not that might be any kind of example of something or a reasoning.
May I really quickly?
Okay.
Yeah, I really appreciated the way in which you worked through juxtaposition as a kind of strategy, and I also really appreciate you saying that you're not going towards understanding. I think that's really important. It brings up this really interesting issue about the voice, which has been touched on a few times throughout the conversation, which is that we tend to think about the voice as a vehicle for understanding, right? And that communication is a kind of communion with somebody or something else, which is the opposite strategy of one of juxtaposition and discontinuity. And science, modern science, has a really interesting way of also thinking about communication as a kind of communion, as a kind of oneness, by the way that it posits sort of universal kinds of phenomena, such as the voice and the heartbeat. And so the way in which scientists understand that volcanoes communicate is the same pattern as the human heart communicates, is electricity communicates in the same way. That's a kind of metaphysics of sameness through which everything can participate and communicate, which is the opposite of one of discontinuity, which privileges difference.
Okay, one last question.
Yes, testing.
Yeah.
I just wanted to ask the panel, but also KUNCI. And I wanted to highlight a topic which I haven't really heard, at least the second half of the day. Maybe it got lost somewhere over lunch. But this is the actual process of decolonization. And going through that process, but also trying to understand how that process is being done here in this institution, but also conceived in the Netherlands, having been abroad for 12 years. So I'm learning. I'm doing field work as we speak. But I think it also relates to Yuki's question just now. It's related to the performance, but I think also the method. I heard a lot about the methodology, and especially methodology in relationship to theory. The theory is described in Western context and in Western terms. I haven't heard these decolonized or post-colonial theories yet being addressed. But also the methods. I mean, for KUNCI as well, you're choosing to focus on the audio guide. So you're using that guide, which is already a colonial type of method. Are you decolonizing that guide, or are you recolonizing that guide with your own voice? Indeed, what about the performance? You're using steps, but those steps are guided, as you say, the body is related to the space. The space is not decolonized. The space is still that space. And you're also not moving in or outside of that space. You're still using the museum space and the museum authority imprint of the space as a methodology. You're using interview, which is as well an anthropological tool that is also established within a colonial context. We're now doing a symposium with a panel that seems to, each panel member seems to want to have his or her say before we can move on to a question, where I know that in Indonesia there's a tradition, Javanese as well as beyond, nongkrong, where we basically discuss as a group, not panel versus audience. So yeah, the question is about methods and methodologies. Are you able, do you feel that this program, this institution, but also this country, this nation, which is in a sense still living the colonial, and its institutions and bureaucracy are part of the colonial, that you can actually decolonize it, or do you feel that you have to recolonize it with the same methods?
Or pursue unconsciously.
Thank you.
Thank you. A very difficult and hard question as the last question, which actually, according to the standardized procedure of symposium, we should be finished by now and start to the next session. Yet then we have this question fleeting, and we need to answer it. So, what should we do? Carry on.
The context of decolonizing. Okay, we did talk. We did address about this at the first panel, but we didn't get through it so much because we are also concerned about the hype around the term. But at the same time, that's always our practice, taking in the big words and try to really see the limits of it, right? And then in Indonesian, we have the term called menggembosi, which means if you have a tire, and then what you do is you make little punctures, basically, in order for the tire to, like, it's a sabotage, basically. And this is exactly what we're doing by trying to create these audio guides. It's not just to intervene within the space itself, but to try to make kind of small holes, because it's online. And then we try to engage with people from outside, not just from outside of the museum within the Amsterdam context, but for people also back home in Indonesia, to try to imagine actually the kind of limitations or the kind of politics of gaze representations that we're dealing with here, but also not only in kind of like descriptive way, but also in trying to also kind of like intervene it in the process of trying to reverse. Like if you say, true, we're using methods, but we're using methods as a tool to fight back against the master, basically.
Okay, because I receive small hand gesture from other KUNCI members that they want to talk. But then I also want to say, as the editor of the audio guide, maybe you should listen to it first to see how it's a different. Yes, we will have a time to play it so everyone can hear it. But it's also, I think we are playing with this being clear and unclear. Because what is decolonizing? It's not fully washing. It's not clean out of colonialization. That we are free, yet because we are also aware that we are here because we are part of the elites. We speak English. We fits to the criteria of Indonesian can work in this kind of institution. So we're able to do it. And so this whole idea of decolonizing, maybe it's good to go back to the way we address it through the material, which is the sound itself, which is the audio guide itself. And then we'll see how these forms of listening, these forms of juxtaposing sound and voices can really makes us realize something is not working. Gita.
I just wanted to say that I feel there's a problem if we think that the symposium or the way of speaking, communicating in this kind of way as a Western model, and that we are replicating the Western gaze of our Western way of knowledge. We should also think this as a way of appropriating or reclaiming. And on the other hand, I also don't want to see decolonization as a as a differences between West and the East, because I can also say that if we are keep on just using particular or peculiar Indonesian words, it's also a way of exoticizing our own precarity or our own methods which actually just make the West and the East cannot have encounters. So that's one thing to respond to your comment about us replicating. But on the other hand, we also realize that there are, in some ways, we are also replicating the colonial gaze, which we are critically reflect it on when we see the Papuan people, and you can hear it on the audio guide. Also about the guide, it's not really a guide actually, because we don't give information. Then that's why it's really important to listen to it before commenting on it. Yeah, it's not really an information, but more like evocative questions of the gaze that this colonial theater present. Also, lastly, it's related also with our limitation in dealing with this bureaucratic institution, because this is a huge museum. It's like a church. It works like a church. So it's really impossible to actually rearrange or reorder the museum displays, and that's why sound became like the most practical and critical methods to intervene without really being, without really materially touching it or reordering it.
So I have to end this session, although we still have the energy to discuss.